Reacher is trapped. No weapon, no backup. Just concrete walls, a locked door, and men outside who want him dead. This is a CIA Blacksite, the kind of place that does not exist on paper. The kind of place where people go in and never come out. But Reacher is not most people. And in the next few minutes, this Blacksite is about to become the biggest mistake the CIA has ever made. It started with a drive. A small piece of plastic, barely the size of a thumb, handed off on a moving train by a woman named Anna Merrick before she vanished into the crowd like she'd never existed at all. Reacher didn't know what was on it. He didn't need to. The moment two black SUVs boxed him in outside the station, he understood the drive was worth more than his life to somebody, and that somebody was willing to prove it. He woke up hours later, strapped to a chair, wrists raw, the taste of blood in his mouth, and a man in a gray suit asking the same question over and over. Where is the drive? Not who gave it to you. Not what do you know. Just the drive. Like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Reacher gave nothing. Not because he was tough, though he was, but because the moment he talked, he was worth nothing to them. And dead men worth nothing get buried fast. So he took the hits. He counted the exits he couldn't see. He listened to footsteps in the hallway, counting how many pairs of boots, how many doors between him and open air. Somewhere down that same hallway, in a room just like his team was going through the same thing. He didn't know their condition. He didn't know if they were alive. All he had was the sound of the building itself, vents humming, doors buzzing open on electronic locks, the particular quiet of a place built to keep noise in as much as keep people out. Then, without warning, the questions stopped. The man in the gray suit walked out, and the room went silent in a way that felt wrong. Not calm. Wrong. The kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Reacher had spent his whole life reading rooms, reading people, reading the half-second before violence turns real, and every instinct he had was screaming that something had shifted in the building. Maybe backup had failed to show. Maybe someone made a mistake. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that made him pull hard against the cuffs, someone on his side had gotten loose first. Down the hall, that's exactly what was happening. One of his people had worked a wrist free, found a weak hinge on a restraint never meant for someone who'd spent years learning to disappear from exactly this kind of room. There were no guards standing over them anymore. That was the first sign something had already gone wrong for the other side. The second sign came when they heard it. Not gunfire, not shouting, just the dead, heavy quiet of men who'd expected an easy job and gotten something else entirely. When the door finally opened, it wasn't a guard standing there. It was one of their own, knuckles split, breathing hard, already moving before a single word was said. Get up. We're leaving. Now. There was no time to ask what happened to the man who used to be in that hallway. There was no time for anything except finding the others, finding a way out, and getting off the grid before whoever was in charge of this place realized their prisoners weren't prisoners anymore. They were the last thing standing between this Blacksite and the outside world finding out it existed at all. The hallway smelled like bleach and gun oil, the kind of smell that told you this place had been cleaned up after worse nights than this one. Reacher moved fast but quiet. The cuffs gone from his wrists now. Dragging a chair leg, he'd snapped off and sharpened against the floor, because a man with nothing was still a man with something if he was willing to use it. Room by room, they found the others. One of his team had a split lip and a stare that said she'd already worked out 3 ways to get through a locked door before anyone told her which direction to run. Another was limping, favoring a leg that had taken a boot to it more than once. But he wasn't slowing down, and nobody offered to help him because everybody in that hallway understood the same thing. Slowing down here got you killed. They checked the guards on the floor, the ones who weren't getting up anytime soon. No weapons. Somebody had locked them away before this shift even started, which told Reacher this Blacksite had rules even its own guards had to follow. Rules built around the idea that prisoners should never get their hands on a gun even if they got free. That told him something else too. Whoever ran this place had planned for an escape attempt, which meant more men were already coming. A phone buzzed on a table in the next room, still ringing after they'd already found 2 others gone quiet with missed calls stacking up on the screen. Reacher looked at it for a second too long. A ringing phone in a place like this at a time like this wasn't a wrong number. It was a check-in call, and when nobody answered it, whoever was on the other end wasn't going to assume the worst. They were going to confirm it, then send people. Not 1 or 2. A ringing phone meant somebody up the chain already knew something had gone sideways, and Blacksites didn't send apologies when things went sideways. They sent teams, full ones. Reacher grabbed jackets, grabbed the wallets left carelessly on a table like an afterthought by men who never expected their prisoners to need identification again, and started moving everyone toward the back of the building, away from the entrance where headlights would show up first. They found a corridor that led to what looked like a maintenance shaft, narrow, dark, barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders. One of the team got stuck halfway through, cursing under his breath, boots scraping concrete, and for 3 long seconds nobody breathed because a stuck man in a shaft was a target nobody could protect. Reacher shoved from behind, hard, and the man popped through like a cork, tumbling into the next room in a heap, and there was no time to check if he was hurt, because outside, headlights swept across a window, cutting white lines through the dark. And every one of them understood without a word being said that the front of the building had just gone loud. They shut the door behind them and kept moving, boots quiet on the concrete, breath held tight in their chests. Because this wasn't the kind of building you ran through, it was the kind you disappeared through, one silent room at a time. Praying the next door didn't open onto men holding rifles, instead of an empty hallway leading them one step closer to the outside. Outside, the night air hit them like a slap, cold and sharp after hours locked in a room that reeked of sweat and old fear. And for one dangerous second, every one of them wanted to stop and just breathe it in. But Reacher didn't let anyone stop, because standing still in an open alley behind a Blacksite was the fastest way to end up back inside one of those rooms, or worse, in a shallow grave nobody would ever be assigned to find. The alley ran narrow between 2 brick walls slick with rain that hadn't quite stopped falling. And at the far end, where the alley opened onto a side street, shapes were already moving. Men in dark jackets, moving in pairs, the kind of disciplined spacing that told Reacher these weren't hired muscle grabbed off the street for the night. These were professionals, trained to sweep a location fast and quiet, which meant the team had minutes, maybe less, before this alley turned into a shooting gallery with nowhere to hide. He pushed the group toward a stack of pallets and rusted dumpsters, using them as cover, counting bodies as they moved. 1, 2, 3, 4. Everyone accounted for except the ache in his own ribs where a boot had connected hours earlier, an injury he shoved to the back of his mind because pain was a problem for later, and later only existed if they survived the next 60 seconds. That was when the car appeared, headlights off, engine barely above idle, rolling to a stop at the mouth of the alley in a way that made every muscle in Reacher's body coil tight, ready to fight, ready to run, ready to do whatever it took to keep his people breathing, until the passenger door swung open and a voice hissed out into the dark, low and urgent, telling them to get in, telling them there wasn't time to explain, telling them the men behind them weren't going to stop hunting until somebody was dead. Reacher hesitated for exactly as long as it took to decide the car was a smaller risk than the alley, and then he was moving, shoving the wounded man in first. Then the woman with the split lip, then the rest of the team, folding themselves into a vehicle built for half as many people as it now carried, elbows and knees jammed together, breath fogging the windows, hearts hammering loud enough that it felt like the men outside should be able to hear it. The driver didn't wait for the door to fully close before flooring it, tires spitting gravel, the car fishtailing out of the alley and onto the street just as the first of the pursuers rounded the corner. Weapons raised, muzzle flashes lighting up the wet pavement behind them. The rear windshield spiderwebbing from an impact that missed flesh by inches and buried itself instead in the headrest where someone's skull had been half a second earlier. Nobody screamed. Nobody had the air to. They just held on, pressed low, waiting for the next impact, the next shattered window, the next moment where the whole night finally caught up with them. But it didn't come. The driver cut hard around a corner, killed the headlights completely, and threaded the car through a gap between 2 parked delivery trucks so tight that mirrors screeched against metal on both sides. And for a moment, the world outside the windows went black and silent. And Reacher realized the driver wasn't panicking, wasn't guessing, was following a route he'd clearly planned out long before tonight, which raised a question louder than the gunfire they'd just survived. Who was this man? And how long had he been watching that building? The answer came a few blocks later, once the driver was satisfied nobody was still on their tail, when he finally glanced in the rearview mirror and introduced himself in a voice that was too calm for what they'd all just lived through, giving a name that meant nothing to any of them, followed by a job title that explained everything and nothing at once. freelance journalist, the kind who chased stories nobody else wanted to touch, the kind who camped outside buildings for weeks because his gut told him something was wrong, long before anyone handed him proof. He said he'd watched them get carried into that building on a gurney, watched 2 more get walked in hours later, and made the kind of connections that got journalists either famous or killed. Sometimes both, concluding this had to be a Blacksite, an off-book location where the rules everyone else lived by simply didn't apply. And when he saw them trying to escape through that alley, he didn't think twice about driving straight into the middle of it, because a story like this one, the kind that could blow the lid off a program nobody in Washington would ever admit existed, was worth more to him than his own safety, which either made him brave or reckless. And in that particular line of work, Reacher had learned a long time ago that there usually wasn't much difference between the two. The team sat in stunned silence as the city blurred past the windows, streetlights sliding over battered faces and torn clothing, every one of them running the same numbers in their heads. How many men had they left behind on that floor? How many more were already fanning out through the city searching for a car that had vanished into traffic? And how long it would take before whoever was really in charge of that Blacksite realized their entire operation had just been exposed to a stranger with a camera and a notebook and absolutely no intention of staying quiet about what he'd found. Reacher watched the journalist's hands on the wheel, steady despite everything, and understood that this ride wasn't the end of the danger. It was the start of a different kind. The kind where the enemy wasn't just the men who'd tortured them for information, but everyone connected to them, everyone with a reason to make sure this story never saw daylight. And that list, Reacher suspected, was going to turn out to be a great deal longer and a great deal more dangerous than any of them wanted to imagine. The car finally slowed on a stretch of empty road far from the city lights, the kind of quiet highway where nobody would think to look for 4 battered strangers and a journalist who'd just driven straight into a war zone on nothing but a hunch. And it was only then, with the adrenaline draining out of their bodies, like air from a punctured tire, that the full weight of what had happened started to settle over the team. Reacher sat in the back, jaw tight, watching the road behind them through the shattered rear window, counting headlights that never came. And for the first time since the chair and the questions and the endless hours of pain, he let himself believe they might actually make it through the night. But believing it and trusting it were 2 different things, and Reacher had lived too long on the wrong side of too many operations to mistake one quiet stretch of highway for real safety. He turned to the journalist, the man who called himself Russell Plum, and asked the only question that mattered now. Who else knew about this car? Who else knew this route? Because if the answer was anyone connected to whatever agency ran that Blacksite, then this ride wasn't an escape at all. It was just a longer, slower version of the same trap. Plum's hands tightened on the wheel, and for the first time since he'd pulled them out of that alley, his calm cracked just slightly, just enough to show the fear underneath it, because the truth was he didn't fully know.